Howdy, Sam from Science, looking at asexual and sexual reproduction. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So Science Understands, we're going to look at cells arise from pre-existing cells, and cell division leads to an increase in cell number. Cell division in somatic cells is different from cell division that produces gametes from germline cells. Continuity of life requires replication of genetic information and is transferred to the next generation through processes including binary fission, mitosis, meiosis, and fertilization. We're going to go through all of these in a lot more detail in other videos. And you need to be able to explain why the amount of DNA in a cell doubles before division. So, cell division. Cells divide. All cells come from pre-existing cells, so previous cells produce the cells that we have today, and future cells will be produced from today's cells. Cell division is where cells turn from one cell into two, so we're dividing cells into two. There's different ways that cells can divide. So in multicellular eukaryotes like us, we use mitosis to produce regular cells, so that's our somatic, our body cells, our non-sex cells, whereas sex cells, our gametes, so sperm and ova, they're produced by meiosis, which is a different process. They're similar, there's just another division involved in meiosis. Bacteria are different, they're reproduced by binary fission, but also some very simple eukaryotes can reproduce through binary fission too. A key point is that the DNA has to be replicated before the division occurs, otherwise you'll end up with cells not containing DNA, and if they don't contain DNA, they don't contain the information required to build things like enzymes and proteins within the cells, and if they can't do that, they don't do chemical reactions and they will die pretty quickly. So we need to make sure the DNA is always replicated before cell division occurs, so that the new cells produced, they each get a copy of the DNA required for them to sustain their lives. It means that genetic information is carried from one generation of cells to the next. If we're talking about sexual reproduction, we're talking about one generation of organisms to the next as well. So let's talk about asexual reproduction in eukaryotes. You can propagate some organisms without fertilization asexually, and this is done through cloning, and this can be done in a few different ways depending on the eukaryotic organism. We can't do this as humans. Plants and some animals can. The key thing is it's a mitotic process. So mitosis is reproducing the cells, and then a part of the organism breaks off. So that's mitosis, it's not meiosis. No sex cells are involved. And again, we're going to go through mitosis in a bit of detail later on. So plants can asexually reproduce by budding, by making bulbs or sending out runners. Sea stars, anemones, hydras, and some worms can reproduce asexually, and these are animals. But again, the cells are produced through mitosis, not meiosis. So asexual reproduction involves one parent, no fertilization, and produces genetically identical offspring, no matter how it occurs. So because it's done through mitosis, we're getting identical daughter cells being produced. We're going to talk about fertilization in a bit of detail later on as well. So let's look at budding, for example. So here we have our parent, and here we have our bud growing off of our parent. This is a hydra, I would say. Mitosis is producing the cells that are producing this bud. The bud breaks off, it floats around, finds another place to sit down, and then it starts to grow and get bigger, and then it can bud off as well. The bud is genetically identical to the parent. There hasn't been any shuffling or rearrangement of genes to produce new cells asexually, to produce new sexual cells such as sperm or ova. It's just mitotic division of the parent cells that has produced the bud here. Plants can undergo vegetative propagation as well, and again it's just using mitosis. So fragmentation, you cut a part off a plant, you chuck that in the ground, that part that you cut off can start growing roots, and then it becomes, it'll start growing, start reproducing more cells, and it'll become a whole new plant. Grass is really good at this. Just cut off a bit of grass, chuck it in the ground, and you start making more grass pretty quickly. Sprouts from root systems, this can make whole forests. Apomixis, which is where a plant produces a flower that doesn't need fertilization, and the ovule can become a seed, and which can then be blown around. So we're basically doing a lot of the parts that would happen in sexual reproduction, but we don't have to do the actual sexual reproduction bit. The ovule just becomes a seed which is blown around, so dandelions can do this. The reason why this works is because plants have a huge range of undifferentiated cells which can then differentiate later on. So they can sustain and renew growth indefinitely. So they can turn from undifferentiated cells into specific types of cells within the plants once their circumstances change. This is very difficult for complex animals like us to do. We're going to go through tissue culture a bit later on. Because plants have this ability and lots of undifferentiated cells, we can do things like tissue culture pretty easily with plants. So here's a carrot. We take some cells, root cells from one of the roots that's growing off the carrot. Chuck it in a culture medium, we'll get lots of mitosis happening, we'll start to get a plantlet being produced, we can chuck that in the ground and we'll make a new carrot. This carrot is identical genetically to the original carrot that we looked at. In prokaryotic organisms, asexual reproduction happens through binary fission, and again we'll go through this in a bit more detail a bit later on. The processes that happen are pretty easy though. We have a single chromosome in prokaryotic organisms. That chromosome replicates, so we get 2 copies of that chromosome. The chromosome attaches to the cell membrane, the cell gets longer, and eventually the cell splits off and we get 2 copies of the cell. The DNA has to be replicated before any of this happens, because if we didn't have the DNA in this cell here, we would just have basically a cell membrane and some cytoplasm. Not much more would happen, because you need the DNA inside the cell to produce things like enzymes which run the chemical reactions of life. Sexual reproduction leads to diverse offspring, and that's its benefit in terms of evolutionary history. So new carrots will make 2 cells, usually a male and female sex cell. A sperm and an ova is typical, and they're referred to as gametes. Sometimes things like flowers can do selfing, which is where the sex cells from the same plant can produce a new plant. We can't do that in humans. So referred to sperm and ova in animals, but in plants you can get pollen and ova as well. The gametes are produced through meiosis, which produces cells with half the number of chromosomes. So then if we join those cells with half the number of chromosomes together, we get the full number of chromosomes back together, and that's called fertilization. Again, we'll look at this a bit later on. We're going to learn some new words that go along with this, like haploid and diploid and so on. Here's the process. We start with a cell. That cell goes through 1 division, which leads to 2 cells. Those 2 cells then divide, which leads to 4 cells. That second division produces 4 cells, each with half the required chromosomes to make a complete cell. So if you join those 2 of those 4 cells together, you can get your fertilization happening and then your offspring from that. And that's what fertilization is. I've got some terminology here. So somatic cells are just regular old body cells that aren't sex cells. So non-sex cells in organisms, we refer to them as somatic cells. So they would have the full complement of chromosomes. In humans, that's 46. So my cheek cells will have 46 chromosomes in them. My heart cells will have 46 chromosomes in them. Sex cells will have half of those though. Somatic cells in an organism are produced through mitosis, and this is the mitosis process here. And again, we're going to go through this in a bit more detail. The DNA replicates in interphase. The chromosomes get replicated in interphase here. We go through a whole series of steps which leads to 2 cells being produced which are genetically identical to each other. So this is regular mitotic division. So let's do our check. So all cells come from existing cells, and cell division increases cell number. Cell division in somatic cells is different from cell division that produces gametes from germline cells. So we've got mitosis versus meiosis, for example. Continuity of life requires replication of genetic material and is transferred to the next generation through binary fission, mitosis, meiosis, and fertilization. And you need to be able to explain why the amount of DNA in a cell doubles before division. So now for the science, we looked at sexual and asexual reproduction. That's it for the science today. See ya.